Hello there, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be exploring the Milky Way galaxy as we see it in the state that it resides in within the Federation Starfleet's universe. Just to lay out exactly what that means, we're going to talk about not the galaxy in any specific era, more what all the quadrants are and how exactly the Federation Starfleet tends to break the galaxy up and what exactly that means. So, with that out of the way, please like, share, and subscribe, and let's get into explaining exactly what and how the Federation breaks up the galaxy. In its most basic level, Starfleet, humanity, the Federation, breaks the galaxy up into 4 quadrants. That's how it does it initially. The galaxy, as we know, the Milky Way, is about 100,000 light years across. Now, at maximum warp, we know from Voyager ended up 75,000 light years from Earth. It would take about 70 odd years to get back if they traveled in a straight line, traveling at maximum warp, indicating that, say, at about warp 9.9, you can travel about 1,000 light years in a year. Now, distancing in Star Trek is a bit like scaling. Sometimes they're a little wonky. Distances, they don't always seem to match up. It should take several days to travel from Earth to Vulcan, and sometimes that journey seems to be a lot quicker. Kronos should be much further, and sometimes those distances are a little skewed, but we'll have to, for the sake of enjoying the show, ignore those little logical inconsistencies sometimes and suspend your disbelief. In addition to breaking the galaxy up into the alpha, beta, gamma, delta quadrants, they break the galaxy up into smaller sectors. The average sector is about 20 light years across in a sort of cube. Remember, space is three-dimensional, which is, again, sometimes a logical inconsistency we will get to in a little bit. Now, one thing I will point out, which always does bug me personally when I'm watching it, which is one of the reasons I felt I should explain this for people, is when they are looking at the galaxy, say Voyager finds a wormhole that's going to bring you back to the Alpha Quadrant. Just bringing you back to the Alpha Quadrant doesn't mean it brings you back anywhere near Federation space. Space is big, real big, and the Federation actually only occupies a really, really tiny fraction of the Alpha Quadrant. Also, the way it's sometimes portrayed, maps aren't as accurate. This is why maps don't really work in the three-dimensional space of the Federation universe, because not everyone claims the space in between star systems. Also, you don't always claim it system to system to system. Sometimes you claim system, then claim nothing, and then claim a system. Look at old colonial empires on Earth. Let's use the British one, which is the one I'm historically most familiar with. If you were to go with the logical assumption that you always conquer what's near to you, when the British Empire was in full swing and expanding in every direction, we should have been conquering France and Spain and Holland and Denmark and Germany, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, because they're all close to us. But instead, we went out to Asia, to the Americas, to Africa, the Middle East. You extrapolate this theory into both an imperial sense in the Klingon and Romulan empires and in a happy alliance kind of sense like the Federation, just because you have a ball of territory here, especially if you're the Federation, a member state might want to join us over here, but no one in between. As a result, your space is kind of fragmented and all over the place. So although it's portrayed sometimes on maps as being a big blob, it's more just a sort of a fuzzy area that you either have influence in or you control. And the same sort of thing with the Romulan and the Klingon empires. Also, despite often being noted as being Alpha Quadrant powers, both the Klingons and the Romulans are Beta Quadrant based, which means their main power bases, centers of industry, political spheres of influence are actually mostly centered in the Beta Quadrant, particularly the Romulans as they're further out. And the Klingons, we know, have expanded, sent ships as far as the Delta Quadrant, so by the 24th century anyway. So we're looking at the galaxy sometimes a little human-centric, which is one of the things the Federation tends to struggle with. Now, other powers, of course, exist in other quadrants. Referring to the Dominion as a Gamma Quadrant power is accurate, but saying that they rule the entire Gamma Quadrant would be inaccurate. They control the area of space on the other side of the Bajoran wormhole, but with how close the Changeling homeworld was, and the races that were near to the wormhole actually either not really being part of the Dominion, like the Dosai who kind of worked with it but weren't part of it, or the Karama who were part of it, being close to the wormhole, but the Changelings also not being too far from it, indicates the Dominion was neither as big or as truly gargantuan as it implied. Certainly it was big, certainly it was powerful and controlled or exercised a lot of power and influence, but it was not a quadrant spanning power. The Dominion did not control the whole Gamma Quadrant, the same as the Borg don't control the whole Delta Quadrant. And on that, the Borg in the Delta Quadrant control a vast region of space. The Swarm also control a vast region of space. Again, this is how the galaxy is broken up. 4 quadrants and then into sectors. The Borg control multiple sectors, as do the Swarm, as does the Federation, although Borg and Swarm territory on their own are substantially massive. But no one power is so politically influential or huge that it controls everything. The Borg are probably one of the few truly galaxy-spanning powers, and even then, not all races have heard of them, encountered them, or know who they are. So, space is big, just to emphasize that point once again. So, what are the powers in all the different quadrants? Again, let's review. In the Alpha Quadrant, we can only really speculate about the powers that are close to Federation space. Historically, you had races like the Iconians, the Preservers, who were all and very powerful at one time or another. The Organians, very powerful, but powers that span beyond their borders to travel outwards. Iconians have been gone for a while. They may or may not be back. It's a little vague. May or may not be extinct. Little vague. But the Federation is predominantly an Alpha Quadrant power. The Ferengi Alliance is predominantly an Alpha Quadrant power, as are the Cardassians and the Breen. The Gorn are also predominantly Alpha Quadrant powers, as are the Tholians. The Federation, out of all of these, has the greatest presence in the Beta Quadrant, but generally operates about 2/3 of its forces as an estimate within the Alpha Quadrant, with the Beta Quadrant being more almost like a borderland zone to keep the Klingons and the Romulans back. Is almost how it always seems to be treated. That's where all the military installations are. That's where all the patrol zones are. That's where all the DMZs are, and the neutral zones of the Romulan and Klingon empires. They don't have the same sort of issues in the Alpha Quadrant, at least not to the same degree. The Gamma Quadrant, the only major power we know about in the Gamma Quadrant were the Dominion. We do know that a colony of Borg thrived there for a while, but seem to have no issue with the Dominion, again implying and strongly showing us that the Dominion did not control all of the Gamma Quadrant, because if it did, by now it would have been spilling over to the other quadrants. Also, it should be pointed out that these are again humans who've broken up the galaxy this way, and the Federation's kind of gone along with it. It's not how the Klingons and the Romulans and others break it up. Not necessarily. It may be a map system they've adopted, but likely they don't break the galaxies up into the same quadrants. This is how the Federation does it, into sectors and into quadrants, and then has different forces allocated and controls of them. Into the Beta Quadrant, again, the obvious powers are the Romulans and the Klingons as the two major powers, but you've also got slightly lesser powers in the Beta Quadrant, such as the Orions, that also control seemingly quite a lot of territory there, but nothing compared to the Romulans or the Klingons. Moving over to the Delta Quadrant, we do see multiple seemingly almost nomadic races that seem to police quite large regions of space, making it fairly different to the more entrenched areas of the Alpha and Beta Quadrants, and even the Gamma. The Borg, for example, galaxy spanning, goes without saying. The Swarm, one of the more entrenched ones. The Kazon control large regions of space, but their borders fluctuate very regularly, making maps not very effective. The Hirogen are very nomadic, with their forces spreading out through the Delta, Beta, and even touching into the Alpha Quadrant if their communications array alone is to be used as a basis. Also, the Beta Quadrant seems to have a number of small spatial vortexes that allow other races like the Malon, for example, to move around more rapidly and more widely. We also know that a spatial vortex of some description was encountered by the USS Equinox that traveled several thousand light years, allowing them to get a little bit closer to Earth. Not to mention the Borg Transwarp Hub network, the subspace conduits utilized by the Vaadwaur and by others after them. Basically, there are multiple different ways that other races. There's one race that utilize very advanced transporters that have 40,000 light year range. We encounter races that use subspace catapult technologies, coaxial warp, quantum slipstream drive. The Delta Quadrant seems to be a very good concentration of very advanced superluminal propulsion systems, far beyond those traditionally used in the Alpha and Beta Quadrants, indicating that perhaps the influence of the Borg, would be my hypothesis, on those regions has forced the development of such technologies, either through the Borg's culling and farming techniques to sort of try to encourage such developments, or simply just by the Borg's sheer presence and other people either adapting Borg technology, sharing technology with one another when they get something advanced to try and keep everyone one step ahead of the Borg. Who knows? Give me your theories in the comment section down below, but it isn't exactly unnoticed that there are a substantial number of borderline nomadic, or at least very well-traveled races that live in the Delta Quadrant, whose territories or borders are very ill-defined. But getting to the more defined ones, like the Borg, like the Swarm, using those two as an example, Voyager would take several months to traverse Borg space. It's simply that big. The Borg probably control the largest region of territory anywhere, and unfortunately for Voyager, Borg space seemed to bisect the galaxy. And we can only assume that they weren't thinking two-dimensionally and couldn't just go over it or under it. It was massive. Swarm territory seems to be similar. Again, unfortunately for Voyager, expanding to the, lack of a better term, east and west directions of the galaxy, so extending from the Delta towards the Gamma, but wasn't very deep, unlike Borg space, which is why it only took about 4 days at high warp to get through Swarm territory versus the months to get through Borg. But again, I'm assuming couldn't go up, couldn't go down because their territory was controlling a lot of space that way. It's the only logical conclusion, otherwise they were really stupid in their approach, and instead of antagonizing the Swarm and breaking Federation rules about penetrating red faces territories they don't want you to, they could have just gone over it. But we'll leave it at that. And that's how, basically, the galaxy is broken up in the Federation's universe into 4 quadrants and then into smaller sectors. Each one typically is about a 20 light year cubed region of space. And that is, again, the end of this video. If you made it all the way to the end, please like, share, and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed it.